"Do you have any day-old cake?" the little boy asked. Then the billionaire heard him. Caleb stood trembling in the doorway of the bakery, his little sister strapped to his back with a faded bedsheet. He had spent the day in the cold collecting bottles and cans for his mother's birthday. A few crumpled dollars rested in his freezing palm, and he clung to a stubborn little hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would let him have a cake that was headed for the trash anyway. But the baker didn't hesitate. "We don't give away product." Caleb swallowed the shame rising in his throat and turned toward the door. That was when a deep, steady voice cut through the quiet. "Wait!" An elderly billionaire rose from a corner table and reached for his wallet. What he did next changed their lives forever. This story was made to share a few quiet truths about kindness, and I'm glad you're here to hear it. Snow fell thick and heavy that evening, turning the streets of downtown Columbus into a winter painting of white and shadow. Ice crystals caught the warm, golden light spilling from the bakery windows, making the whole storefront shimmer like something out of a dream. Inside, families laughed over birthdays and anniversaries, their voices soft behind the thick glass. Children pressed their noses to the display cases, pointing at towering cakes covered in buttercream rosettes and sugar pearls, treats that cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month. Right outside, pressed against the rough brick wall beside the entrance, young Caleb Hayes tried to make himself invisible. His thin jacket had come from a church donation bin winters ago, the synthetic filling long since flattened into something useless against the Ohio cold. Holes in his sneakers let in slush with every step, turning his socks into freezing sponges. His stomach had stopped growling hours earlier, settling into that familiar hollow ache he had learned to carry like a stone behind his ribs. But Caleb's discomfort was secondary. It had been secondary for a long time now. Strapped to his back with a worn bedsheet knotted carefully across his chest was his little sister Hannah. She was bundled in every spare layer Caleb could find that morning. Mismatched mittens, a knitted hat 2 sizes too big that kept sliding over her eyes, and a fleece zip-up that once belonged to him and now swallowed her small body whole. Hannah kept her face pressed against her brother's neck, her breath coming in soft little puffs he could feel even through the cold. She had been quiet for a while, drifting in and out of exhausted sleep, lulled by the rhythm of his walking the way she always was. She wasn't crying. Even at her young age, she had somehow learned that crying wasted warmth they couldn't afford to lose. Caleb adjusted the knotted sheet for what felt like the 100th time and peered through the frosted window at the display case inside the bakery. On the lowest shelf, past the gleaming wedding cakes and custom orders wrapped in silver ribbon, there had to be something left over from yesterday, something nobody wanted anymore, something headed for the trash before morning. It was his mother's birthday. Rachel Hayes lay in the back bedroom of their small apartment on Glendale Avenue, unable to stand without gripping the wall, unable to work, unable to do much of anything except breathe carefully and try to smile when her children came in to check on her. The workplace accident had shattered 3 vertebrae in her lower back and left nerve damage the doctors described in careful, measured language that Caleb had taught himself to understand. She would not get better on her own, not without surgery, not without rehabilitation, not without money they simply did not have. Before the accident, Rachel had been a certified nursing assistant at Mercy General Hospital for years, working double shifts and keeping her small family afloat with the quiet, disciplined love of a woman who refused to let hardship be an excuse. She was the kind of nurse who remembered every patient's birthday, who brought homemade soup on her own time, who held hands in the dark and sang softly to people who had no one else. She had been exceptional in the quiet way people are when they are doing exactly what they were made to do. Then the accident happened. A patient lift that had been flagged for maintenance multiple times over several months was never serviced. The equipment failed mid-transfer. Rachel caught the falling patient and took the full impact across her lower back, crumpling to the floor while the patient she had just saved stood over her asking if she was all right. She lost her job along with her health. The hospital placed her on medical leave, which became unpaid leave, which became termination. The same hospital whose faulty equipment had put her on the floor. The insurance company denied her workers' compensation claim almost immediately, citing a so-called pre-existing condition, a claim that was false, and one Rachel had the medical records to disprove. She had never had a back problem in her life before that afternoon. She knew the system well enough to understand what was happening. Years of hospital work had taught her exactly how insurance companies operated, how claims got buried under paperwork and delays and denial letters designed to wear people down until they gave up. She had tried to fight the appeals herself from bed, organizing everything into a manila folder she kept under the mattress because the kitchen table was too far to reach on bad days. But knowing how the system worked and being able to fight it from a 2-room apartment with no income, 2 children, and chronic pain that made sitting upright for more than a few minutes feel like a victory. Those were 2 entirely different things. The free clinic gave her what medications they could, but supplies were limited. On the months when the numbers simply did not add up, when it came down to her medicine or her children's food, Rachel quietly made her choice. She never told Caleb the full weight of what she was carrying. He was already carrying too much. Sometime after the accident, their father left. Caleb tried not to think about it directly if he could help it. Thinking about it made something hot and ugly rise in his chest that he had no room for. Kevin Hayes had stayed for a while, but he had been more than halfway gone, present in the apartment but absent from everything that mattered. He came home later and later. He looked at the medical bills on the kitchen table and then looked away. One morning, Caleb came out of the bedroom he shared with Hannah to find his father's coat gone from the hook by the door and a short note on the table. "I'm sorry. I can't do this. I hope you'll be okay." Hannah had been too young to remember him. She had never once asked about him. Caleb had read the note twice, folded it exactly in half, and put it in the kitchen drawer. Then he went in to check on his mother, who was lying in bed with her eyes open and her face very still, and he had said, "Mom, what do you want for breakfast?" Because that was the thing that needed doing right then. Doing what needed doing was how Caleb managed feelings he could not afford to have. That morning, on his mother's birthday, he had gotten Hannah up and dressed her in her layers while she protested sleepily, made her oatmeal with the brown sugar she liked, checked on his mother, and brought her toast and water and the medications the free clinic had been able to provide that month. He had not mentioned that one of her prescriptions had run out again. Today was her birthday, and he was going to try to make it good. He strapped Hannah to his back with the bedsheet and took the wire cart out into the cold. He spent the whole day collecting bottles and cans, working the streets he knew best, the park benches near the river, the alley behind the sports bar, the recycling bins at the apartment complex where the building superintendent had told him he could come through before the truck arrived. Hannah rode on his back the whole time, singing the few songs she knew in careful rotation, occasionally falling asleep, occasionally waking to point out a big dog or a man in a red coat. When he cashed everything in at the recycling center that afternoon, the total came to $4.62. Not enough for a birthday cake. Not even close to enough for a cupcake from the gas station. But through the frosted window of the bakery, there was the display case. And in any bakery at the end of the day, there was always something left over, something going to waste. Caleb shifted Hannah's weight, squared his shoulders, and pushed open the heavy bakery door. Warm air rushed out, carrying vanilla and cinnamon and brown butter. It hit him like a wall and made him dizzy with hunger. Hannah stirred against his back and made a small wondering sound as the warmth reached her face. The cheerful conversations inside dulled to uncomfortable murmurs. Customers turned. A woman near the door looked at the snow-covered boy dripping slush onto the clean tile floor and at the bundled toddler on his back, then looked away quickly in the particular way of people who have decided not to see something. Behind the counter, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed gray mustache and a white apron looked up. His eyes did a quick, practiced assessment. "Can I help you?" Caleb's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Do you have any day-old cake? Anything from yesterday that you're going to throw out tonight?" The man's expression did not change. "We don't give away product here." Caleb swallowed. "I have $4.62. I know it's not enough for a real cake, but if it was going to get tossed anyway, it's my mom's birthday and I thought maybe the leftover stuff." The baker crossed his arms. "If you want something, you pay the price like everyone else. If $4 is what you've got, the gas station down the street sells snack cakes. I have paying customers waiting." Hannah had been quiet on Caleb's back throughout the exchange, watching the man with the wide, unguarded attention of a small child who does not yet know she is supposed to look away from uncomfortable things. "Okay," Caleb said. Just that one word, no argument. He had learned that pushing rarely helped. He turned toward the door. That was when the voice came from the corner table by the window. Deep, unhurried, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime being the person in the room that others listened to. "Hold on, son." A man stood from the corner booth, setting down his coffee cup with slow, deliberate precision. He was tall and elderly, with silver-white hair brushed back from a weathered face lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, lines that spoke not just of age, but of sustained grief. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat tailored for him and dark leather shoes polished to a shine. But his eyes were something else entirely. Dark, very still, and profoundly sad. The eyes of a man who understood from the inside what it meant to press your face against the glass of a life you could see but not reach. His name was Richard Langford. He had been sitting in that corner booth for a while, nursing coffee that had gone cold. He came here sometimes when the big house in the suburbs became too quiet to tolerate, when the silence moved through the hallways like something with weight and intention, when he needed to be near other people's laughter, even if it had nothing to do with him. Richard Langford had built a major healthcare network from a single outpatient clinic into one of the largest in the state. Decades of long days, calculated risks, and relentless discipline had made him worth hundreds of millions. He had the house, the cars, every material thing the world said mattered. And he had been the loneliest man in Columbus for some time now. His wife Elizabeth had passed away in the years since. Not suddenly, but the slow kind, a rare autoimmune condition that dismantled her body with meticulous indifference while Richard sat beside her hospital bed and refused to leave. He had flown in specialists, tracked down experimental treatments, bought them extra time together. 8 months of Elizabeth being fully herself, funny, sharp, endlessly curious about other people's stories, the kind of woman who made everyone she spoke to feel like the most interesting person in the room. Then those months ended. They had never had children. Elizabeth had wanted them, and Richard had always said next year, after the next acquisition, the next expansion. The list never got shorter. Then the list stopped mattering entirely, and the rooms of the big house stayed empty. He went back to work because work was the only thing left with a shape he could hold on to. He had a younger sister who lived out of town and called every week. He had his mother, still sharp at her age, who told him plainly that isolating himself in that house was going to kill him faster than any illness. He had people who loved him and tried to reach him. He had built a wall anyway, not out of anger, but out of the suffocating exhaustion of grief that uses up every social resource and leaves nothing for the ordinary work of being someone's son or brother or friend. He had told himself he would reach back out when he felt better. The years had passed, and he had not felt better. Now he sat in a bakery on a snowy evening watching a young boy with a toddler on his back ask for day-old cake, and something in the sealed-off center of his chest cracked open like river ice at the first hard push of spring. He stood up. "Hold on, son." The boy turned. His eyes did a quick, careful assessment. Not frightened exactly, but measuring. The eyes of a child who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly and without sentiment. "Today is your mother's birthday?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir." Richard looked at the little girl on the boy's back. She turned her head toward him, the oversized knitted hat slightly askew, one mittened hand curled around her brother's collar. She looked at him with the enormous, uncomplicated attention of a small child making a genuine assessment. Richard turned to the man behind the counter. "I'll take the best cake you have in the display case right now." The baker blinked. "Sir, the front one is a custom order. I'll pay triple the listed price and cover the cost of a same-day replacement with delivery to the original customer, whatever it takes. This boy needs a birthday cake for his mother." His voice was measured and final, the voice of a man who had been in enough rooms to know that absolute calm carried more weight than volume. The baker looked at the money, at Caleb, at Hannah, who was watching the entire negotiation with focused interest. His shoulders came down slowly. 5 minutes, he said. Caleb had gone very still. Sir, you don't have to. I only asked for something that was going to be thrown away. Richard crouched down so he was at eye level with the boy, his knees complaining after years at a desk, but he stayed there anyway. What's your name, son? Caleb Hayes. I'm Richard. He held out his hand. Caleb shook it with a firm, practiced grip, the handshake of a boy who had been dealing with adults on adult terms for longer than was fair. Happy birthday to your mother, Caleb. The boy's jaw worked for a moment. Something moved across his face, a wave of feeling he caught and controlled before it could fully surface, the practiced discipline of a child who had learned that losing control was a luxury he could not afford. She's sick, he said, because the gratitude was too large for a simple thank you. She had a work accident a while back. She can't stand for long. She can't work. She always made a cake for me and Hannah on our birthdays, even when things were hard. She put real candles in it and everything. I wanted to do that for her. Then she should have one, Richard said, as simple as that. Hannah leaned forward from her position on Caleb's back and regarded Richard with the gravity of someone conducting a serious evaluation. Then she held out her mittened hand. Richard shook it without thinking. Hi, she said. Hello, Richard answered. What's your name? Hannah. That's a very good name. I know, she said, and leaned back against her brother's neck with complete satisfaction. Something shifted in Richard's chest. Not dramatically, but like the first small movement of something that had been frozen for a very long time. The baker returned with an enormous white box tied with silver ribbon. Inside was a 4-tier cake in a pale ivory fondant, with cascading blue sugar flowers and delicate gold leaf accents, a cake designed for a golden anniversary, beautiful and excessive and exactly right. Richard took the box and handed it carefully to Caleb, who accepted it with both arms pressed together, cradling it against his chest the way you hold something you are afraid to drop. Hannah reached out one mittened finger and touched the silver ribbon gently, as if checking whether it was real. Thank you, Caleb said. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Richard stood, but he did not move toward the door. Something in him could not let the moment simply end. Caleb, have you and your sister eaten dinner tonight? The boy's eyes went briefly to the floor. No, sir. We were out all day. I was going to figure something out when we got home. Hannah made a small sound against Caleb's neck. Not a word, just hunger, announcing itself in the uncomplicated way of small children. Would you let me buy you dinner? A real meal, not just cake? Somewhere close by, somewhere busy with lots of people around. I just want to make sure you both eat something before you head home. Caleb's eyes went to the window, then back to Richard. The calculation was quick and unsentimental. Not distrust exactly, but the practical assessment of someone who had learned to weigh every offer carefully against its likely cost. Okay, he said. But can we bring something back for my mom? She hasn't eaten much today. She has trouble getting to the kitchen on bad days. Richard looked at this boy who had spent the day in the cold carrying his sister on his back, collecting bottles and cans, coming up with $4.62, and whose first thought about dinner was making sure his mother had some. We'll bring her a feast, he said. I promise. They went to a family restaurant 3 blocks away, warm and bright and full of the noise of an evening crowd. Caleb settled into the booth with the ease of long practice, shifting Hannah from his back to the seat beside him in one smooth motion, adjusting her hat, checking that her mittens were still attached. Hannah immediately seized the paper menu and began turning it over with great seriousness. She can't read yet, Caleb said. She looks close, Richard answered with a small smile. Hannah looked up. I know some letters. D is for dog, H is for Hannah, S is for snow. Richard nodded gravely. That's excellent progress. He ordered Hannah a grilled cheese with apple slices and chocolate milk. He ordered Caleb a double cheeseburger with fries and a strawberry milkshake. He ordered soup, a chicken sandwich, and a full pasta dinner for Rachel packed to go, along with extra containers. Between bites, Caleb, eating with the focused, grateful attention of someone who had been genuinely hungry, told him about his mother. Her name was Rachel Hayes. She had been a nursing assistant at Mercy General. She loved it. She talked about her patients the way some people talk about their own family. The accident had happened some time ago. equipment failure, a patient lift that had been reported for maintenance multiple times and never fixed. She caught the patient when the lift gave out and took the full impact herself. 3 vertebrae. The insurance company had been denying her workers' compensation claim since almost the beginning. They said it was a pre-existing condition, which wasn't true. She never had a back problem before that day. Richard set his cup down carefully. Mercy General. His company had acquired the parent network years earlier. He still held his board seat because of his ownership stake. But that was not what made his hand pause. "What floor did she work?" he asked. "3rd floor, East Wing mostly," Caleb said, puzzled by the specificity. Why? Richard was quiet for a moment. He wasn't certain yet, but something in him had already begun to recognize the shape of the answer. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "Tell me more about her. Not the accident. Her. What she was like at work." Caleb looked at him with those careful eyes. She talked about her patients the way other people talk about their neighbors, like she actually knew them, not just their charts. She'd come home from a shift and be quiet for a while, like she was carrying something. And then she'd tell me about someone. Not the medical stuff, just who they were, whether their family came to visit, whether they seemed lonely. She never talked about it like it was a job. Richard said quietly, "I don't imagine she did." Some years earlier, during the worst stretch of Elizabeth's illness, she had spent several days at Mercy General. Richard had been there for almost every one of those days and most of those nights. The nursing staff on the 3rd floor East Wing had become familiar presences. There had been one nursing assistant who stood apart. He remembered her not by a single physical detail but by the quality of her presence, the way she moved through the ward with efficiency that never felt rushed, the way she spoke to Elizabeth with full attention every single time, as though Elizabeth were the only patient she had. She had caught Elizabeth's latex allergy early, noticed a mild reaction before it became serious, flagged it quietly to the nursing team with exactly the right degree of urgency, and stayed past the end of her shift on her own time to make sure the substitution went smoothly. She had sat with Elizabeth during one particularly bad night when Richard had gone home to shower and change. When he returned the next morning, Elizabeth had told him about it. "A nursing assistant named Rachel sat with me all night. She held my hand and talked to me about her kids. She talked about her little boy like he was the most remarkable person she'd ever met." Richard had tried to find Rachel afterward to thank her properly, but the search had gotten lost in the gathering urgency of everything else. He had never stopped thinking about what Elizabeth had told him. He looked at this boy across the table, at the dark hair and the careful eyes, and felt the pieces settle into place with quiet certainty. "Caleb," he said, "I think your mother may have helped save my wife's life." The booth went very quiet. Even Hannah seemed to sense the shift. She set down her grilled cheese and looked between her brother and this man. Caleb put his fork down. "What?" Richard told him, careful about the medical details, careful about what was right to share with a young boy. He told him about the days at Mercy General, about the latex allergy that could have become serious and hadn't because one nursing assistant noticed early and stayed late, about the night Elizabeth woke frightened and alone and the woman named Rachel who stayed with her until morning. "She talked to Elizabeth about her children," Richard said. "Elizabeth told me afterward. She said this nursing assistant Rachel talked about her kids the way some people talk about the things they love most in the world. She said there was a little girl and a little boy who was always building things, always making something out of whatever he could find, who was serious and looked after his sister." Something shifted in Caleb's face. He picked up his fork but didn't use it. "She never mentioned it," he said finally. "She never talked about the things she did for people at work. She'd come home sometimes and be quiet for a while, but she never said what it was." A pause. "She's like that. She does things and doesn't talk about them. People who give quietly are the best kind," Richard said. "They do it because they can't help themselves, not for recognition, just because someone needed something and they were there." Caleb looked out the window at the dark street and the snow falling steadily through the restaurant light. "She needs surgery," he said. "The doctors have been saying it for a long time. If she gets it, the right surgery, real rehabilitation after, she might be able to walk without pain again. Might be able to work again. He paused. The insurance company keeps saying pre-existing condition. We have records that prove she never had a back problem before the accident, but we don't have money for a lawyer to fight them properly. And the legal aid attorney who took our case is good, but he's carrying a lot of other cases. He stopped himself. Sorry, I'm not trying to make it your problem. Tell me everything, Richard said. So Caleb did. He told him about the maintenance records, the multiple filed requests on the lift equipment over several months, none of them acted on. He told him about the insurance carrier's accident investigation summary and the 2 factual inaccuracies he had written down and given to the legal aid attorney. He told him about the medical bills organized on the kitchen table by amount owed, smallest to largest, because that was how his mother made them feel manageable. He told him about the free clinic and the medications, how they covered some things some months but not everything every month, and how his mother never made a fuss about the gaps, even though Caleb had figured out on his own what those gaps probably cost her. He told him about his father, the note on the kitchen table, 3 lines. Hannah had been too young to remember him. She had never asked about him, not once. He couldn't handle it, Caleb said. When Mom got hurt, and it became clear it was going to be a long thing, not a quick thing, he just left. He didn't hurt us, he just left. He looked down at his plate. I don't know if it's better or worse that Hannah doesn't remember him. Richard was quiet for a moment, keeping his thoughts about Kevin Hayes carefully to himself. Your mother never complained to you about any of it? Never. Absolutely certain. She talks about what we're going to do next, what the plan is. She doesn't talk about what she can't change. Hannah had been listening in the way small children listen, apparently occupied with her apple slices but tracking everything. Now she looked directly at Richard. Are you our friend now? She asked. It was the question only very small children can ask, straight through every protective layer. Richard looked at her. This little girl who had ridden on her brother's back all day in the cold without complaint, who had shaken his hand in the bakery like it was the most natural thing in the world, who was now waiting for his answer with the patient certainty of someone who expects the world to respond to honest questions with honest answers. Yes, he said. I am. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her apple slices. Caleb was watching Richard with those careful eyes. I'm going to help your family, Richard said. Tonight is just the beginning. Will you let me? The boy looked at him for a long moment. The measured look of a child who had been disappointed by adults enough times to have developed reasonable self-protective skepticism about offers that sounded too good. Why? He asked. You don't know us. I know your mother, Richard said. I know what kind of person she is. I know that she sat with my wife in the middle of the night when my wife was frightened and alone, and she did it because someone needed something and she was there. That's who she is. And I know that someone like that deserves to have someone show up for her. He paused. I've been trying to figure out how to repay that kindness for some time now. I just didn't know to whom. And then your sister shook my hand in a bakery. Caleb was quiet. Then he said, You don't have to repay it. That's not why she did it. I know, Richard said. That's exactly why she deserves to have it returned. A long pause. Okay, Caleb said. Yeah, okay. They packed food into containers. Enough for Rachel and then more, because Richard had watched the way Caleb ate and understood that this family had been hungry for longer than just today. At the grocery store 2 blocks from the restaurant, he bought a full week of real food. Eggs, bread, milk, butter, coffee, fresh fruit, peanut butter, oatmeal, frozen meals that only needed heating, orange juice, children's vitamins. At the pharmacy on the corner, he filled Rachel's regular medications completely. Not partial fills, not substitutions, all of them properly dosed. Caleb watched all of this with an expression Richard was beginning to recognize. Not quite disbelief, not quite relief, something in between. The look of someone recalibrating what they understood to be possible. Hannah fell asleep on Caleb's back somewhere between the grocery store and the car, her face heavy and warm against his neck. Caleb shifted her weight with the automatic unconscious ease of someone who had been doing exactly this since she was born, a motion as natural as breathing. The apartment building on Glendale Avenue was on the third floor of a structure that had once been respectable and was maintaining the memory of that with some effort. The hallway smelled of industrial cleaner doing its best against the accumulated closeness of many people in limited space. Caleb unlocked the apartment door with practiced quiet and called softly, "Mom, we're home. I brought someone." The apartment was small, a main room that served as living room and kitchen combined, a narrow bathroom, 2 bedrooms with a door between them that didn't close all the way. It was clean in the particular way of people who have learned to take exacting care of very little. Above the kitchen table, a paper banner hung slightly crooked. "Happy birthday, Mama." Each letter a slightly different size. Hannah's work, clearly, with Caleb holding the paper steady. Rachel Hayes was in the back bedroom, sitting up against the headboard with a library book open on her lap and a glass of water on the nightstand that Caleb had left within reach before he went out that morning. She was wearing a flannel robe and wool socks, and had the particular careful stillness of someone who had learned to exist within a range of movement that did not trigger the worst of the pain. She was thinner than she should have been. The lines of her face spoke of long months of chronic pain in the way sustained pain marks people, not dramatically, but thoroughly. But when her eyes came up from the book and found Caleb in the doorway, they were immediately and completely present, clear and warm and focused entirely on her son. "Baby," she said, her voice soft with relief, "you were out so long, I was starting to worry." Then she saw the white box with the silver ribbon. Then she saw the man standing behind Caleb. She went still. "Mom," Caleb said, "his name is Richard. He helped me get you a birthday cake, and he thinks he met you before, when his wife was a patient at Mercy General." Rachel looked at Richard. Her eyes did the same careful, unhurried assessment her son did, the same quality of evaluation, the same willingness to hold a conclusion in suspension until the evidence was fully in. It was unmistakably where Caleb had learned it. "Rachel Hayes," Richard said. "3rd floor, East Wing, some years ago. You were the one who caught my wife's latex allergy before it became serious. You stayed with her one night when I wasn't there and she woke up frightened." Something shifted in Rachel's face, quiet and immediate. "Elizabeth," she said. "Yes, Elizabeth Langford." She said it the way you say a name when you are placing a person carefully back in their proper place in memory. She was in the East Wing for several days. She was one of those patients you think about afterward, the kind who sees you as a person, not a uniform. She asked me questions every time I came in to check on her. Real questions, the kind where she actually wanted the answers. A small pause. "She asked about my kids every single time. She told me," Richard said. "She talked about you after she came home. Said you'd sat with her the whole night. She woke up frightened. She asked me to stay." Rachel's voice was straightforward about it, stating a fact without ornament. "She was scared, and she didn't want to be alone, so I stayed." She looked at him steadily. "I would have done that for any patient." "I know," Richard said. "That's exactly the point." A silence passed between them, the particular silence of 2 people thinking about the same person who was no longer in the world and finding they could share that silence without explanation. "I'm sorry for your loss," Rachel said finally. "Truly. She was a remarkable woman." "She was." Richard cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hayes, your son told me about the accident and the insurance situation. I have resources, legal resources, medical resources that I'd like to put to work for your family. I'm not asking for anything in return, I'm asking if you'll let me help." Rachel looked at her son. Caleb met her eyes steadily. Then she looked at Hannah, still asleep and heavy on Caleb's back, one mitten dangling from its clip. She looked at the white box with the silver ribbon. "Sit down, Mr. Langford," she said, nodding toward the wooden chair beside her bed. "You've clearly been standing up long enough. Tell me exactly what you're proposing, and tell me what you expect to get out of it. I need to hear that part too." He sat, and he answered that second question first because it was the right question, and she deserved a real answer to it. "I expect to feel like a person again," he said. "For some time now, I've been going through the motions, running a company, attending meetings, sitting in bakeries alone in the evening because I can't stand the silence of my own house. I built everything I built and then lost the only person it mattered to, and I haven't known what I was for since then. Tonight, when I heard your son ask for that cake, something woke up. I don't want to let it go back to sleep. That's what I expect to get out of it. The chance to do something that actually matters." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded once slowly. The nod of someone who recognizes honesty and is choosing to meet it with equal honesty. "All right," she said. "Now tell me exactly what you're proposing." He did, and Rachel Hayes asked him specific, intelligent, well-organized questions. She asked about the attorneys he knew and their track records in workers' compensation cases specifically. She asked about the medical specialists he had mentioned. She asked about timelines and realistic outcomes. Richard answered everything honestly. He did not dress things up or promise outcomes he couldn't guarantee. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor in the doorway the entire time, his homework notebook open on his knee, taking actual notes. Rachel noticed. Richard noticed her noticing. "He does that," she said quietly, with a flicker of something in her face that was unmistakably pride. "He doesn't miss much." "I can see that," Richard said. At the end of a couple of hours, Rachel looked at him for a long moment. "Then I'm going to let you help us. But my children come before everything. Before any plan, before any timeline. They come first." "Of course," Richard said. "That's not a condition. That's just obvious." "Nothing is obvious until it's said," Rachel told him. "I say it anyway, then it's said, and I mean it." She nodded once. Then, as if the formal part of the evening were concluded, "There's food on the table that your son apparently brought, and I haven't eaten since noon. You're welcome to stay while we eat, Mr. Langford, if you don't have somewhere to be." "I don't," Richard said. "And please call me Richard." Before he left that night, Richard helped Caleb position the space heater safely in Rachel's room. He made sure Hannah was covered with her blanket on the couch where she had fallen asleep mid-dinner. He stood in Rachel's doorway and said, "Happy birthday, Rachel. Your son carried his sister on his back all day in the cold, trying to get you a cake." Rachel looked at Caleb, who was in the kitchen doing the dishes without being asked. "Caleb," she said softly. "It was just cans and bottles," he said without turning around. "It was nothing." "It was everything," Rachel said. And then to Richard in a voice that was quiet and direct in equal measure, "You look tired, Richard. Not just tonight, tired. The kind that goes all the way down." She paused. "Come back tomorrow if you want. Bring yourself, not just groceries." He drove home through the slowing snow. The house in the suburbs was as quiet as it always was when he walked in. But for the first time in some time, the quiet felt different. Less like an absence and more like a pause before something. Most people don't realize how insurance companies actually win. It isn't by being right. It's by making the fight so long, so exhausting, so expensive in time and hope and dignity that ordinary people simply stop. Rachel Hayes had refused to stop. But there are limits to what one person can do alone, and those limits, after a long struggle, were very close. Richard did not sleep that night. He sat at the desk in his home office and read every document from Rachel's folder that Caleb had photographed and sent over. The denial letters, the appeals, the accident investigation summary, the maintenance requests. By the middle of the night, he was angry in the cold, contained way of someone who had spent decades building systems and knew with precision exactly how this one was being deliberately abused. He called his personal attorney first thing the next morning and laid out everything. He also called the head of orthopedic surgery at Columbus Medical Center and the administrator at Mercy General. The conversations were brief and to the point. The hospital's legal team would reach out to the carrier that day. He drove to Glendale Avenue that morning with groceries and medications. Caleb opened the door, looked at the bags, and said, "You came back?" "I said I would." He sat at the kitchen table with Caleb and explained what he had set in motion, clearly, without overpromising. The attorney, the surgeon review, the hospital conversation. Caleb listened without interrupting. Then, quietly, "She's been in pain every single day for a long time. She never says so, but I see it in the mornings before she knows I'm watching." He looked at the table. "I want her to not be in pain anymore. That's the main thing. That's what we're working toward, Richard said. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He told himself it was to check on the case documents, to follow up on the medical records Rachel needed to send to the surgeon, to make sure the medications were being taken properly. These things were true. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler. He had not wanted to go home. Rachel noticed. She noticed in the precise, unsentimental way of a woman who had spent years reading people, reading the difference between a patient who was resting and one who was slipping, reading the difference between someone visiting out of obligation and someone who simply had nowhere else they wanted to be. On one quiet evening after Caleb had gone to bed and Hannah was asleep and the apartment had grown still, she said, "Tell me about Elizabeth." Richard looked up from the folder of documents he had brought to review. "You don't have to," she said quickly. I noticed you never bring her up yourself. Not since that first night. And I think about it sometimes because I knew her a little in the way you know people when you're with them in hard moments. And I thought maybe you might want to talk about her to someone who actually met her." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he talked about Elizabeth for the first time in some time to someone who was not an attorney or a physician or a board member. He talked about her the way you talk about someone when you have been holding their memory alone in a sealed room and someone finally opens the door. Not carefully, not with any particular structure, just the truth of her spilling out into the warm kitchen of a small apartment on Glendale Avenue. How she laughed, what she thought about, the way she always had an opinion about everything and was usually right, the way she had made him feel for decades, like the best version of himself. Rachel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "She sounds like someone who knew exactly who she was." "She did," Richard said. "I don't think I realized how much I counted on that until she was gone." "You're still figuring out who you are without her," Rachel said. Not a question. "That's different from grief. That's reconstruction. It takes longer." He looked at her. "Years of nursing," she said simply. "You learn to tell the difference." He drove home that night and sat for a long time in the dark kitchen of his house. Then he got up, found the photograph he kept in the desk drawer, Elizabeth at 40, laughing at something just out of frame, and set it on the kitchen counter where he could see it. It was a small thing, but it was the first time in some time he had not needed the photograph to be hidden away somewhere private. A letter arrived at the Glendale Avenue apartment a short time later, official letterhead from the hospital's insurance carrier. Dense legal language that translated plainly to a threat. Third-party inquiries had been noted. Unauthorized advocacy could result in the denial status becoming permanent. Rachel called Richard immediately. Her voice was controlled. The fear was underneath. "That letter is designed to frighten you into going quiet," Richard said immediately. "It has no legal authority behind it. The carrier is nervous because someone called Mercy General, and they know the maintenance records are discoverable. That letter is a pressure tactic. It comes because people who have been improperly denying your claim are suddenly worried." "But what if—" "You do now," he said. "You have someone in your corner." The carrier went quiet after a formal response was filed. Then the building on Glendale Avenue was sold to a new management company. New lease terms would increase the rent by a significant amount in 60 days. An amount Rachel Hayes did not have. Caleb called Richard from a payphone outside the building, his voice at its most carefully controlled, which Richard had learned was the register it dropped into when he was most frightened. "We're going to have to move, but moving is hard for Mom right now. And Hannah's daycare is 2 blocks from here and she's finally settled in, and my school—" "It is my problem," Richard said, "because your family matters to me. Give me 24 hours. He bought the building. His attorney contacted the new management company within the day. By the following evening, the building had changed hands again. He immediately suspended all rent increases for every tenant and commissioned a full assessment of the building's deferred maintenance, the heating system, the plumbing, the second-floor landing light, everything neglected for years. When he told Rachel what he had done, she was silent long enough that he checked the call was still connected. "You bought our building," she said finally. "I did. Richard, I know you cannot just— You spent years showing up for people who needed you, including my wife. The system failed you when you needed it. I have the resources to push back against that failure. This is what pushing back looks like." He paused. "Let me do this." A long silence. Then Rachel said, "Elizabeth would have liked you doing this." "I know," Richard said quietly. "That's part of why I'm doing it." Winter moved slowly into spring. The attorney worked the case with steady, methodical expertise. The surgeon reviewed Rachel's complete records and produced a detailed letter outlining exactly why the surgical denial was not only medically unsupportable, but potentially actionable. The carrier, facing combined pressure from multiple directions and the clear signal that Richard Langford was not going to lose interest, began to move. The surgical authorization was approved. Rachel called Richard from the consultation where the surgeon had given her the news. Her voice was different than he had ever heard it. Lighter. "They approved it. Surgery in a few weeks." He exhaled slowly. "Rachel, that's very good news. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up." "You're not going to wake up. It's real. I wanted to tell you first," she said. "Before the kids. Is that strange?" "No," he said, "not at all." The surgery was a Thursday morning. Richard drove Rachel to the hospital early. Caleb and Hannah stayed with a neighbor who had become something close to a friend over the months. He sat in the surgical waiting room for hours. Bad coffee, a novel he barely absorbed. The double doors at the end of the hallway stayed closed. The surgeon came out afterward and said the nerve decompression had been successful. The structural damage was repaired. The prognosis for functional improvement was strong. When they let Richard into recovery a couple of hours later, Rachel was still groggy, but she recognized him immediately. "Is it done?" "It's done. Everything went well." She closed her eyes. "I'm going to be able to pick Hannah up again," she murmured. "I haven't been able to pick her up in a long time." He sat with her the way she had once sat with Elizabeth, quietly, without needing to fill the silence. Recovery was hard and slow and real. Weeks of physical therapy and deliberate, careful movement. Richard hired a home health aide to help during the days. He adjusted his own schedule and appeared at the Glendale Avenue apartment several evenings a week, arriving with dinner, helping with homework, providing the steady presence that Rachel and her children had been largely without for too long. Hannah began calling him Mr. Richard immediately and without any transitional phase. She provided him with significant updates whenever he arrived. He listened to all of it with complete attention, which she found entirely appropriate. As the weeks passed, Richard noticed a very gradual loosening in Caleb, the set of his shoulders becoming slightly less braced, the laughter coming more easily. One Saturday afternoon, when Richard brought materials for a birdhouse Hannah had requested, Caleb spent hours at the kitchen table completely absorbed, measuring and cutting and fitting pieces together with the focused pleasure of a boy who had for an afternoon forgotten to be the adult in the room. Richard watched him from across the table and thought that is what a young boy should look like. He noticed something else in those weeks and months of showing up. He was sleeping better. The waking in the middle of the night that had haunted him for some time was not entirely gone, but it came less often and left more quickly. The house in the suburbs, when he returned to it at night, felt less like a place where something used to live and more like simply a house waiting patiently for him to come back to it the next morning. Rachel noticed it too. She was a woman who had spent years reading people's conditions. The small signs, the things people didn't say, the gradual shifts in color and posture and energy that told the real story beneath whatever story someone was presenting. She watched Richard across her kitchen table and kept what she saw to herself for now. Then a letter arrived from Caleb's school, a recommendation for the district's accelerated STEM program beginning the next grade. Competitive, application-based, genuinely excellent. The school was a bus ride away. Richard found Caleb on the front steps of the building holding the letter when he arrived that evening. "It's a good program," Caleb said. "I looked it up. A lot of the kids get scholarships." He folded the letter along its original creases. "If I go, I can't pick Hannah up from daycare anymore. The bus doesn't get me back until after it closes. Mom can do more now than she could a few months ago, but she's not ready for that route yet, so I'm not applying." Richard sat beside him on the step. "This problem has a solution that doesn't involve you giving up the program. A home aide can cover afternoon pickup. You not going to the school you should go to, that is a problem I cannot solve after the fact. He talked to Rachel that evening. She resisted as she always did at first. Let Caleb have this, Richard said finally. You spent years making sure other people had what they needed. Let someone make sure your son has what he needs. Caleb was accepted a short time later. The evening the acceptance letter arrived, Rachel was making coffee, standing at the counter on her own, which was still something that felt slightly miraculous, when she caught her foot on the kitchen rug. She grabbed the counter in time and did not fall, but by the time she sat down at the table, she was pale and shaking. Caleb went to her and put his hand on her arm the way he had 100 times before. Rachel put her hand over his and held it. Hannah came in from the other room, assessed the situation, and climbed into her mother's lap and put both arms around her neck. Rachel held both of her children and closed her eyes. Richard was in the doorway with the acceptance letter still in his hand. He stood there and let them have that moment. And he felt something he had not felt in some time. Not like a visitor standing outside something, but like someone who belonged inside it. It was Rachel who saw it first. That was the thing about Rachel Hayes. She had spent years learning to see what people were not telling her. It was the core skill of the work she loved, reading the patient underneath the patient, seeing past the surface report to what the body was actually doing. She had saved a woman's life once by noticing a latex reaction before it became serious. She had caught infections before they spiked, caught medication errors before they compounded, caught the particular graying around the eyes that meant someone was in more pain than they were admitting. She had been watching Richard for months, not intrusively, not with clinical detachment, but the way you watch someone you have come to care about. She watched him because he showed up for her family again and again, reliably and without drama, and because something in his color had been concerning her. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't seem to touch. There were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, where he would pause mid-sentence from something else, a momentary interruption she recognized as the body asserting itself over the mind. She had seen him press his fingers briefly against his sternum. She had seen him take careful, measured breaths. She waited. She gathered what she saw. And then, one evening, after Caleb had gone to do his homework and Hannah had fallen asleep on the couch, she sat down across from Richard at the kitchen table, put her hands flat on the table, and said, "When did the irregular heartbeat start?" Richard looked at her. "I'm not guessing," she said. "I've been watching you for months. The fatigue, the way you catch your breath sometimes, the thing you do with your hand on your chest when you think no one is looking. I've seen enough cardiac patients to know what I'm looking at." She held his gaze steadily. "When did it start?" A long silence. "A couple of years ago," he said finally. "My cardiologist has been monitoring it." "When was your last appointment?" 3 months ago. And since then?" He was quiet. "Richard?" Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice she used when she needed a patient to hear something they had been avoiding. "You have been managing this alone. The same way we were managing everything alone before you walked into that bakery. And I am telling you the way you told me about the insurance letter, the way you told me about the rent increase without softening it. I am telling you that what I am seeing is not something to manage alone anymore. You need to call your cardiologist tomorrow morning. Not next week, tomorrow." He looked at this woman sitting in her flannel robe in her small kitchen. Long months of her own suffering behind her, and a full day of physical therapy, and 2 children, and the quiet, endless labor of rebuilding her life, and she was using what she had left to look after him. Something broke open in his chest that had nothing to do with the arrhythmia. "You've been watching me," he said. Someone had to. He called his cardiologist the next morning. She called him in immediately for a full workup. The arrhythmia had progressed, she told him. The new medication protocol would help, but the contributing factors accelerating the progression needed to change. The sleep deprivation, the sustained elevated stress, the isolation. "Your heart has been keeping a tally," she said. "Grief is not free. Isolation is not free. Something has to change." Richard drove to Glendale Avenue that evening and told Rachel what his cardiologist had said. She listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How long have you been managing this alone? A couple of years. She nodded slowly. You came to our apartment that first night and you sat with me for a couple of hours and you answered every question honestly. You told me what you expected to get out of helping us. You were more honest with me that first night than most people are with their own family. She looked at him. And then you spent months showing up for us and telling none of us that you were carrying this. She called toward the back bedroom. Caleb. He appeared in the doorway in his school clothes, homework under his arm. Sit down. Richard has a heart condition he's been managing alone. He needs to stop managing it alone. The same way he helped us stop managing everything alone. That is what this family does for each other. Caleb sat down across from Richard. He looked at him with those careful, direct eyes. What do you need? He asked. 11 words. The simplest possible question asked by a young boy to an elderly man with no drama and no hesitation and no suggestion that the asking was unusual in any way. Something in Richard that had been wound tight for a very long time released. I need to not be alone as much, he said. I've been alone in that house for some time and I've told myself it was fine. It hasn't been fine. Then stop being alone, Rachel said. We're right here. Hannah appeared from the other room, assessed the room with her customary thoroughness, and climbed into Richard's lap. She leaned her head back against his chest. Are you sad, Mr. Richard? A little? A little, he said honestly. Okay, she patted his arm. I'll stay here for a while. Thank you, Hannah. You're welcome. He took the cardiologist's medication protocol seriously from that day forward. He reduced his board commitments to what was genuinely necessary. He started sleeping. Real sleep. He called his sister and had the conversation she had been asking for, the real one about the wall he had built and what it had cost them both. He invited her to come the following weekend. She arrived with her husband and their 3 children and filled the house with the kind of noise that a house built for a family is supposed to have. She met Rachel and Caleb and Hannah at dinner that Sunday evening. Within minutes, she had her arms around Rachel, telling her with complete sincerity that she was the most impressive woman she had met in years. Caleb and his sister's eldest son ended up spending hours talking about engineering programs. Hannah taught her youngest niece a song from school with great pedagogical patience. Richard sat at the head of the table and looked around at all of them and felt the room blur slightly. His heart, his cardiologist noted at his next appointment, was responding well. The arrhythmia readings had stabilized, the stress markers had dropped measurably. Whatever you're doing differently, she said, it's working. Someone was watching out for me, Richard said, when I wasn't doing it myself. Good, let them keep doing it. In December, exactly 1 year after that night at the bakery, Richard arrived at the Glendale Avenue apartment to find it transformed. A small Christmas tree with paper chains Hannah had made, lights strung along the window, a paper star at the top cut and folded by Caleb with geometric precision. The whole apartment smelled like gingerbread. Rachel met him at the door, moving entirely on her own. No cane, no wall to hold. Careful and strong and completely herself. You're just in time, she said. The frosting situation requires supervision. Hannah, now a little older and fully in command of the kitchen table, was working through an entire container of green sprinkles. She looked up when Richard came in. Mr. Richard, you're helping. He agreed, sitting beside her. Caleb looked up from his homework and gave Richard the particular nod that boys give when they are genuinely pleased to see someone but have decided that expressing this directly would be undignified. They frosted cookies. They ate dinner. They put Hannah to bed together, the 4 of them moving through the small apartment with the easy rhythm of people who have learned each other's patterns so thoroughly that nothing needs to be discussed anymore. Then Rachel and Richard sat at the kitchen table with coffee while Caleb finished his homework in the next room. 1 year, Rachel said. 1 year ago, Caleb was on the street with Hannah on his back asking a stranger for day-old cake. 1 year ago, I was sitting in a bakery alone in the evening because I couldn't stand another night in my own house. She looked at him. Are you glad you went? It's the best thing I've done in a very long time, Richard said. We're not done yet, she said. Not by a long shot. Spring came again to Columbus, and with it Rachel's return to work. She went back part-time first, building her strength carefully, then full-time at a supervisory nursing assistant position at a long-term care facility a few blocks from Glendale Avenue. Better management, better equipment protocols, a staff that had heard about her case through the healthcare network and specifically requested her when the position opened. Her first day back, she came home and stood in the apartment doorway and put both hands over her face and cried. Not the controlled private kind, the real kind. The kind that had been waiting a very long time for its turn. Caleb put his arms around her from one side without saying anything. Hannah came from the other room and climbed up and put her arms around her mother's neck. The three of them stood in the doorway making a pile of each other until Rachel laughed through the crying and said, Okay, I'm okay. I just needed a minute." "A whole minute," Caleb said, completely straight-faced. 2 minutes. Take 2. He kept his arms around her. "Take as many as you need." Richard had been coming up the stairs when he heard it through the door. He stood in the hallway and gave them their moment. When he knocked, Hannah answered. "Mr. Richard, Mama went to work and she came home and she didn't fall down or anything." "That is excellent news," Richard said. In October, nearly a year after Rachel had first noticed the signs in Richard and sent him to his cardiologist, the legal case reached resolution. The settlement covered lost wages, all surgical and rehabilitation costs, future medical monitoring, additional damages related to the equipment failure, and appropriate compensation for the improper denial process. The specific figure remained confidential. The attorney called it one of the cleaner outcomes he had achieved, given the quality of the documentation. Rachel called Richard when the attorney told her the number. She did not speak for almost a full minute. "Carol, I'm here," he said gently, then caught himself and smiled. "Rachel, I'm here." A long, slow exhale. "My kids are going to be okay," she said very quietly. "I mean, they were going to be okay regardless because I was going to make them okay no matter what, but now they're actually going to be okay. Not because I fought hard enough against impossible odds, just okay, like other people are okay." A pause. "I can breathe. I don't remember the last time I could just breathe." "You're going to have to get used to it," Richard said. She laughed through the tears he could hear. "This is your fault, you know, all of it. I'll accept that. You walked into a bakery and heard a young boy ask for day-old cake and decided to care about it. That's why any of this happened. Your son carried his sister on his back all day in the cold trying to get you a birthday cake," Richard said. "I couldn't walk past that. Most people do. I know." A pause, then very quietly, "Elizabeth would be proud of you." He looked at the photograph on his kitchen counter, Elizabeth at 40, laughing at something just out of frame. He had moved it there from the desk drawer the night Rachel had asked him to talk about her. "I think she sent me there," he said, "to that bakery, that specific night." "I think so too," Rachel said. In February, sometime after that first snowy evening, Richard incorporated the Hayes Langford Family Foundation. The name was deliberate, not the Langford Foundation. Hayes Langford, because this was a partnership, and because Rachel Hayes deserved to have her name on something that helped people the way she had spent years helping people without ever asking anything in return. The mission was focused and specific: legal advocacy, medical navigation support, and emergency financial stabilization for working families facing workplace injury claims. The gap between what the workers' compensation system was supposed to provide and what it actually delivered to people without resources or connections, people the system was designed to exhaust into giving up, was enormous. Richard now understood that gap from the inside. He had read every denial letter. He had watched Caleb call from a payphone. He knew what that gap cost. Rachel joined the advisory board. She sat in meetings with attorneys and policy specialists and said things like, "That process sounds efficient on paper. Here is what it actually looks like from the other side of the desk." And the room listened. The attorney led the legal work. The surgeon joined the medical advisory panel. Richard's sister organized the first fundraising committee. The foundation's offices opened in a small suite of rooms on the east side of Columbus, deliberately placed in the neighborhoods where the families they intended to serve actually lived. One plaque at the entrance read, "In memory of Elizabeth Langford, who saw people. This foundation sees them too." Richard had written those words in the middle of the night and read them to Rachel over the phone before they went to the engraver. His voice had been unsteady. "She would have written it better," Rachel said. "She would have, but she's not here, so this is my best effort." "It's good, Richard, it's really truly good." The foundation opened and the first cases came through. An accident on the north side, workers' comp denied multiple times. Another through a hospital social worker, another through a union representative. By the time fall arrived, they had served dozens of families with a waiting list growing longer every week. At the foundation's first anniversary fundraiser, Caleb stood up to speak. He was older now, taller, his voice beginning its shift, wearing a blazer Rachel had pressed carefully the night before. He stood at the front of the room with the composed ease of a boy who had been the most responsible person in a room for most of his life and had simply learned to be comfortable with that. The room went quiet. "A while back," he began, "I spent an entire day collecting bottles and cans. My sister was on my back the whole time. She was little and I carried her every step the way I always had because that's what needed doing. By the end of the day, I had a few dollars. It wasn't enough for a birthday cake for my mom." He paused. "So I went to a bakery and asked if they had anything day old, anything that was going to be thrown out that night, and a man in the corner heard me." He looked at Richard, who was standing to the side of the room with his sister beside him. "He didn't just buy my mom a cake. He came to our apartment that night and sat with her for a couple of hours. He came back the next morning with groceries and her medications, and he started making calls. He found us an attorney. He found a surgeon. When our landlord raised the rent and we had nowhere to go, he bought our building." He paused. "He did all of this because he saw us, because that's who he is." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. "But I want to say something else, something I don't think gets said enough." Richard was alone for some time before he walked into that bakery. Really alone. Not just no company, but the kind of alone where you stop being fully a person because there's no one to be a person for. He came to our apartment every night that first week, and my mom, who was lying in bed with 3 broken vertebrae and months of insurance denials and no money, my mom saw it. She saw that he was not all right. She started watching him the way she used to watch her patients, and after a few months she told him to go to the doctor. She told him his heart was giving out and she could see it, and he needed to do something about it. He looked at Rachel. She saw him the way he had seen us. And because she said something, because she was paying attention even when she had every reason in the world to only be paying attention to herself, he got the help he needed. He looked back out at the room. "My mom used to say you see someone who needs something and you do it. She said it about being a nursing assistant, but I think it's bigger than that. I think it's about choosing to actually look at the people around you, to not look away from what you see." Applause. Richard looked at us. My mom looked at Richard. We looked out for each other, and that's the whole thing. That's all it is. He sat down. The applause was long and genuine. Rachel put her arm around him. Hannah climbed into his lap and put her head against his chest. Richard stood across the room and looked at the 3 of them and felt the room go slightly out of focus. His sister put her hand on his arm. "Elizabeth would have loved all 3 of them," she said quietly. "She would have," Richard said. "She absolutely would have." Later that evening, after the donors had left and it was just the 4 of them eating leftover appetizers in the empty event space, Caleb said in the way he sometimes produced observations that had clearly been forming for some time, "Do you think about her a lot, your wife?" "Every day," Richard said. "Every single day." "Does it hurt less than it used to?" Richard thought about this honestly. "It hurts differently. It's still there. It will always be there, but it's become part of something larger. Part of why I was in that bakery on that specific night." He paused. "She used to say that love doesn't diminish when you spread it out. It multiplies. I didn't understand what she meant when she said it. I think I do now." Caleb nodded slowly, turning this over. Hannah held out a small cheese pastry to Richard. "Mr. Richard, this one has the cheese inside. You should eat it." "Thank you, Hannah." "You're welcome. It's the best kind." "It is," he agreed and ate it. Rachel met his eyes across the table and smiled. The full, unguarded smile of a woman who had come through something hard and found herself more fully on the other side of it than she was before. He smiled back, and maybe that is what second chances really look like. Not a single dramatic moment of rescue or redemption, but a long, quiet series of ordinary evenings. Coffee going cold on a kitchen table, a child's homework spread across the floor, someone asking if you're okay and actually meaning it. Two people who each thought they were only giving, slowly realizing they had been receiving all along. Outside the windows of the Foundation's event space, Columbus moved through its October evening. Leaves turning, streetlights coming on one by one, the first faint edge of winter in the air. The same season that had started all of this with snow falling thick on a bakery window, and a boy with his sister on his back and a few dollars and a request so small it nearly disappeared into the noise of a cold evening. Nearly, but not quite, because someone was listening. And because someone else lying in a flannel robe in a two-room apartment reading a library book with a glass of water within reach would spend the following months watching quietly, keeping count, seeing what needed to be seen. They had found each other, this family and this man, not by plan, not by design, but by a child asking for something nobody wanted on the one night when the right person happened to be listening. You see someone who needs something and you do it. That's the whole job. Caleb, Rachel, and Richard's story reminds us of something quietly powerful. No act of kindness is ever too small to matter. A boy asking for day-old cake on a snowy night. A stranger choosing not to look away. A mother noticing the pain in someone who came to save her. None of it looked extraordinary in the moment. And yet, that single decision to listen, to step forward, to care, reshaped 3 lives at once. Because kindness does not travel in only one direction. It circles back. It restores the giver as much as the receiver. Sometimes the greatest turning points don't arrive with noise or spectacle. They begin with a simple choice to see someone, to stay, to help. If this story touched your heart, I hope you carry a piece of it with you. Have you ever experienced a moment when one small act changed everything? I'd love to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. We would truly love to hear your story. Thank you for being here with us. We wish you and your loved ones health, peace, and a life filled with steady, enduring love. And remember, when you see someone who needs something and you choose to do it, that's where miracles begin. In the quiet glow of that snowy evening, this story whispers a truth that wraps around your heart and refuses to let go. The smallest spark of kindness can mend lives that feel forever broken, and it always circles back to heal the giver, too. Young Caleb, with his little sister Hannah bundled against his back and just a few crumpled dollars earned from a day of scavenging in the cold, wasn't chasing miracles. He simply wanted to give his mom Rachel something special on her birthday, even if it meant asking for day-old cake no one else wanted. But when Richard overheard that trembling plea, something ancient and aching inside him stirred. He didn't just hand over a fancy cake, he stepped fully into their world, offering groceries, doctors, lawyers, and eventually a steady, fatherly presence that pulled their family from the brink. What he didn't expect was Rachel's gentle eyes seeing straight through his own hidden grief and loneliness, the kind that had kept him isolated in a silent house for years. She noticed his failing heart the way she once noticed patients who needed her most, and in caring for him, she gave him back the family he thought he'd lost forever. That's the beautiful ache of it all. Kindness isn't a one-way street. It restores the giver as much as the receiver, turning strangers into something deeper, something like home. You see someone who needs something, and you do it. That single choice can rewrite everything. If this story wrapped itself around your heart the way it did mine, tell me in the comments. Has one small act of kindness ever changed your life or someone you love? Share your story. We read every single one. And if you're craving more tales that remind us what truly matters, hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and join our little family here. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for being here. We're so glad you stayed.